Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. When communities are thinking about what types of hazards they should be preparing for, oftentimes they don't think about airline crashes. In this episode, I speak with John Webb, who was the Emergency Social Services Director during the time of Swissair Flight going down over Peggy's Cove, Flight 111, and how that community really stepped up in a very difficult time. So stay tuned. Hey, John, how are you doing today? Good to see you again.
Great, Leanne. Nice to talk to you too.
So we talked previously about the work that you did as emergency manager for the province of Nova Scotia. And at that time, you mentioned a little bit about the Swiss Air Flight 111. And I wanted to come back and revisit that with you. And so we could, talk about some of the stuff you learned. So how about if you just back up and think back those many years ago of what happened that day? What actually happened with Swissair Flight 111?
Yeah, it was September 2nd, 1998, Leanne. And late at night around between 10 and 11, we live right in the city, and we could hear ambulances and fire departments and fire trucks and the whole bit going, and not just one, a number. We said, there's something up. And being an emergency guy, I said, okay, well, I'll wait for my phone to ring. We're not first responders, by the way. We're second responders as emergency social services. Yeah. So we're even though we're linked into 911, we wait for our call. And we said there must be something. And then we turned on the news. And sure enough, about an hour later, we heard there was a plane crash near Peggy's Cove, about 10 kilometers out to sea at Peggy's Cove. So as information went, I said, well, okay, I'll just go to sleep, and when it's ready, we'll hear more about it. So when I woke up early the next morning, about 6 or so, my phone still hadn't rung, but we turned on the news, and it was all on the news that Swissair 111 with 229 passengers had crashed off Peggy's Cove, and there appeared to be no survivors. So as soon as I heard that, I said, okay, I am going to get a call, and I sort of wait rather than bother the emergency operations center, because and to see what we do. But I said, this is different, because this is not like we're emergency social services. Let me explain that for a second first. There's first responders that everyone knows when they call 911. There's police, fire, and paramedics in the medical system that you see most. There's a big network in behind. There's second and third responders. Who is responsible for non-emergencies is usually responsible for emergencies in government. I was director of emergency social services at that time. I was director or manager of income assistance for Halifax, and just involved with that work. And we hadn't really developed, but I was part of that network. So what happens is, when an emergency happens, whatever department, if the province is and municipality is responsible for non-emergencies, it's then responsible for emergencies. So income assistance in non-emergencies are responsible for helping vulnerable people that are in dire need. So when emergency happens, emergency social service, we contract people like Red Cross, Salvation Army, and those to help. But our emergency workers also, at the side of their desk, social assistance workers, at the side of their desk, is emergency social services. So we help set up shelters and reception centers and help with psychosocial care of all the people in reception centers is our normal work. When there's fires, floods, and people are evacuated, then we set up shelters. And that's what people often wonder. I wonder what happens to people when fire and police take them away. We take care of them until they can get back to a normal setting. So people often see Red Cross as one of the main ones, but it's the government. It was our department, and I was one of the ones responsible for doing emergency social service. So in this case, here was 10 in the morning, and I still hadn't gotten a call and said, well, what is our role going to be? There's no survivors. Here's a plane that has crashed. It must be just horrific what's going on. So then at 11 o'clock, I got a call, report to the operations center. When I got to the operations center, who was mobilizing they were trying to determine whether it was a plane that was shot down, or was it a plane that indeed had some mechanical problems or whatever. And indeed, they determined later on that it was a plane that had some problems with a fire in the cockpit because of the communications, and then couldn't get it distinguished quick enough or land. So they landed. They didn't know if it was up or down, and they landed face first into the ocean. And it was a huge crash off Peggy's Cove. Peggy's Cove, as most people would know in Canada, is a little icon here in a peaceful place in Nova Scotia. So it landed there. So what happens is when a plane lands like that and it's a crash, you could hear it for miles and miles away. What happens? The fishermen and fisherwomen from all the areas got in their boats, and everybody went to the site to try to help, see if there's any survivors. And same with the military got mobilized. The province immediately mobilized, probably Bedford Institute and a number of other organizations that had boats to go out. And what they discovered, of course, was body parts. Imagine all the fishers that were there, and all the community, 229 people, the crew that was just landed there. That then they started to, they realized at a certain point that it was just recovery. Here's all the ambulance people and the fire people wanting to help, and there was no one to be able to help. There was apparently one intact body. One little child, it was an intact body. Everything else were body parts. So then, when we're in the operations center, we said, well, okay, there's nothing for us right now. Let's wait. So of course, but we were at the operations center, and they were starting to mobilize. And then once they did, the media came immediately, of course, from all over. A crash happened. That became a big problem, trying to see what do we do with the media. They descended on Peggy's Cove in different places. So they had to get control. The fire and police had to get control, and they were the main ones with emergency management that called in the military as well and said, well, we've got to start recovering people. What are we going to do with those? So in that night, I remember too, it was this would have been the second night when they were starting to realize that it was just recovery, and body parts were really would start literally washing up to shore. You imagine the community and the devastation of the community that was there. It was just incredible. All of Halifax was enthralled with this here massive crash that happened in our community. So it was decided then, okay, what will, with the recovery, how is that going to be done? And then realized with that too, that if a crash happens, the families are going to come here. They're going to descend on here. To Nova Scotia. So they started to organize and mobilize. And down in Peggy's Cove, we took over Peggy's Cove. And then the first night to mobilize to start recovering the parts and the bodies. And I remember being at the operations center, and they said at 12 midnight, the second night, when here was September 2nd, and there was a nice, cool, warm breeze and everything. But down at Peggy's Cove, there was such a buzz of hundreds of people and the fishers and all organizing. They stopped, and the minister who was down there stopped and said over loudspeakers, please, let's stop. Let's have one moment of silence. And we were listening to this from the operations center. And I still remember that feeling of helplessness, but also of wonder about those poor souls that died and what we were now involved with. But that 1 minute of silence, that are down there, the people that were there that day at Peggy's Cove with a moonlit night, that 1 moment of silence put the realization of how fragile life is. So that's when, from there, it started to realize, okay, who was doing what? This is new to us.
Yeah.
And who's going to corral the media? So they decided then they needed a morgue. There's no morgue that could handle all those parts. And I remember in the operations center said, we need 600 body bags. And someone was saying, well, why do they need 600 body bags? There's only 229 people. And they realized the parts, how are they going to orchestrate that? So what they did is they then said, okay, we need a hangar. So the military over at Shearwater set up a hangar. to deal with all the blood. And hundreds of people then were mobilized there to not only get the body parts to start to nab them. DNA was relatively, new to this extent at that time, and also the plane parts to see what was what happened here. So, in the media again, just infiltrating and trying to talk to everybody that was there. So I remember that was one thing with the hangar. I remember going over to visit the hangar on day 2, and I said, look at those big freezer trucks that are there. I wonder what they're for. And I realized that's for the body parts. There was fridges and freezers that were there. So at any rate, they started to mobilize the military, especially, and the fishers in the area, getting the parts that they take it over to the hangar. And the hangars then would the people there would start to organize those parts. And then what happened is they said, now the families are going to come and they're going to want to come. Delta Air was the ones responsible. It was Swissair, but their partner here was Delta. It was apparently the first crash that had new protocols for the airlines to take responsibility for the flight if it crashes. In other words, you better pick up their game, because before there wasn't as much organization. So I remember the person that came from down Atlanta way was there on day 2 and came with 2 assistants, and they took over the Lord Nelson Hotel. This was a major hotel that was going to be going to renovations. They took over the hotel and said, we are there, because one of the things they looked at too at the operations center, okay, if the families come and the families are going to be there, who's going to pay? That's one thing in emergencies that you have to find out from the beginning, is who's going to pay. Is this if there's a gas leak and all those things, are the gas companies going to pay? And you have to ask those questions. Delta took responsibility.
Good.
And I remember then they said, we're going to take over this hotel and we're going to arrange for the families to come here within days. So imagine the logistics with that. But can you local people help us? I remember going with John Byrne, the head of Red Cross, and going to a meeting. They said, you'll have 15 minutes with this person who was with Delta. She comes in with her 2 entourage. She was just a real pistol. And she came in and she said, we are having all those people come here. We'll give them the best service. What do you need? And we said, of course, well, we're going to, social services and Red Cross said, we'll do 2 or 3 things. We'll be able to help with the operation of this Lord Nelson, because we had to register everybody. We had to register, make sure that they were, it matched up with the manifest, that they were people. We had to make sure they get medications, because when people came and just jumped on a plane, they may be distraught. They need psychosocial care. Delta provided psychologists or social workers with every family members that came. They set them up. So as it went on, they said, well, where are the gaps? What are going to be needed? And they said, one of the biggest things that's going to be needed is the logistics for taking, for caring for the people at the Lord Nelson Hotel, so that the medical examiner can give briefings to the families, so that they can talk about what are going to happen with the bodies. Can I go down to Peggy's Cove and see them down there? So we needed 3 sites then, one at the Lord Nelson, one at the Peggy's Cove, to make sure when they go out to the rocks to see them, what would happen there. So we had to set up a huge tent down there. And the city manager, city emergency operations person was there. I mentioned his name before, Barry Manuel, was the one who was in charge of Peggy's Cove. Imagine trying to corral and get organized all the, the military to go in sync with the RCMP and the local emergency people, and then deal with the media. Restrict the media to the center, but yet give them enough briefing. So that was trying to decide it. And then we set up a center at the social service center at the Red Cross, which was downtown. So what was the Red Cross going to do? They said, well, here's the gaps. We need at the psychosocial care of the people in the community was massive, because you imagine all those people that they were telling their kids who go swimming after school and go fishing, don't go near the water. Don't go near you imagine all the search and rescue. There were many of them that went out and helped comb the beaches. And apparently one of the and the psychosocial aspect of, so we set up a 1-800 number through the Department of Health. Department of Health, then we helped them coordinate. I was taking minutes for it. I remember it vividly, and I still have the minutes, that we got the Nova Scotia mental health, head of mental health for the Nova Scotia Health Department, chaired a committee to say, okay, who is going to do the psychosocial care? And we got someone from the RCMP, someone from the military, all those people all around the table saying, who's doing what? And of course, they were taking care of their own people with the psychosocial aspect of that. But who's taking care of the community? Yeah. That's a gap. What's going to happen? So I remember calling, because I was connected to, through Arm Prior and through my emergency training, Department of Health and Department of Social Services. There was a man called Ray Lafond. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's an expert in psychosocial care. He helped set up the manual for psychosocial care in disasters. And I got him to come down for a day or two to help to help John, too, the head of mental health services, to chair the committee to make sure everyone was doing right. When we saw the gap was the community, Raymond took brochures down that we got retyped and put in every mailbox. If this happened to you, if an emergency happened, here's what you can say to your child. Here's what you can say to your adults. All those brochures. We set up a 1-800 number. There was a movie done on Swissair about that, and it also mentioned what the number of divorces after, or the number of suicides, because the community was so devastated because of what they saw in their community. If you can just imagine. Apparently one person that we'd heard the story of was fine when he was out taking parts and everything, but when he saw a hand floating by with a wedding ring on it, that was devastating. Yeah. That was devastating because he realized that was a family person. So the 2 or 3 aspects that we set up was and Red Cross jumped into it. We big time, because our social assistance workers and everything had full-time jobs. We were over our heads. So we Red Cross and Salvation Army, but we were there, we're responsible for it. But we hadn't had a formal contract at that time with Red Cross. We got one a year or two later. And that's why we were more prepared for September 11th. But with this here, so there was 3, it was doing the psychosocial care for the community, making sure we coordinated that everyone wasn't duplicating psychosocial care. It was taking care of the media. That wasn't our responsibility, but we were involved with that a bit to restrict them so that they weren't talking to our families that came down. Yeah. We set a big tent up down at Peggy's Cove, so the families come down with buses. We helped arrange buses through the transportation company to take the families down. Then we arranged with pharmacies to fill prescriptions with the doctor right there. Those sorts of things, because they were careful down there too. We had bottles of water and flowers and sand for Peggy's Cove for the families to take with them. But we found we had to watch out too. There was one family so distraught they almost fell off the rocks and fell in. Some of them, one or two apparently, even wanted to go and jump in. You know, they were so distraught. Yeah. So those were the things. The other thing that we did was over at the hangar, we had psychologists we set up a trailer so that we had psychologists there, that everybody who was in the hangar dealing with the body parts would have to go through that trailer. And then the last thing was at the Lord Nelson, when the families started to come in, we registered them as social services. We made sure they had care and that they were ready for the briefing, that they had all the information. And then that they were carted down to Peggy's Cove, and then there was arranged for a service and all those logistics that were, so anyway, that was the no, I mean, you know, in your line of work, I mean, on the emergency social service side, you train for certain situations and you get experience with them and you think rationally this is how it's going to work. But when something like that happens, I'm just not sure you could ever really prepare for what you're going to see and what you're going to have to do. And, you know, the family is just so overly complicated.
And just the visuals that you'll never get out of your head, that you just thought, I often wonder how first responders deal with it, because they see so much many people should never have to see, right? So as far as I think of communities in general, when you're thinking of various scenarios that could impact you, that you should plan for, I don't think this one tends to be that high on people's radars, yet when you explain what happened to you and all the stuff you had to do, it's one I think communities should prepare for. What would happen if a plane was shot down or just, crashed not far from your community and you didn't have to deal with the situation?
And most people I think, who are in government or whatever, say, well, what will we do? And it's mind-boggling, especially if you're one that wants to deal in the visuals. The main thing is to make sure, and I said this in the last blog, is to make sure that you have your networks in place, that the communication is there. That is so important, because networking and be involved. But it's hard because you can't really plan for an air crash or whatever there. But just to know that, I remember in one emergency, I had a new emergency guy that was down at Oxford, which was a major flood. And this is a good example of that. He was going to first emergency, and I briefed with him after, gave him a debriefing. I said, well, how did you do down there when you thought that you were going to Oxford thinking there was going to be a massive flood to evacuate this town of 1,200 people, and you were the emergency social service one? He said, I cried all the way down. He said, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I said, what made you feel better? When I went to that operation center, he said, and people started to say, well, we'll do this, we'll do that, that I was just part of a team, and they were all there to help me and help each other. That gave me the comfort. So if there's nothing else to know, that you have to just look at the fact of the situation that happens in front of you. If it's a boat or even a bus crash. Imagine a bus crash with 50, 60 people. That would be huge. We've had that happen in New Brunswick with hockey teams and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I guess it's that you can't really prepare for it, but you have to prepare in terms of your networks in advance and think outside. You can't get ahead of yourself. You have to wait to see what the disaster is bringing you and then respond with everything that you have. Yeah. For example, the church groups that were there were massively important because people hung to their religion connected to that. So they were mobilized. We hadn't worked very closely with the churches before, but we realized quickly that they could mobilize because people trusted the churches that were there, and they had the infrastructure, and they could put on a meal in a moment's notice. So all the communities around Peggy's Cove found that out quickly, that people help each other. That's one of the biggest things. Yeah. No, that's great. I appreciate your insights into this. And John, as we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to say that maybe I didn't ask about? Or well, this is kind of interesting. It was amazing with that emergency. It stuck with us for years because I know I got freed up at my work to help coordinate with the Red Cross. But when we heard about it after, everyone wanted to help in the community, but what could we do? And one nurse said, I went to visit about 2 or 3 days into it, I went to visit my mom at a nursing home, and she had a roommate. I went to visit, and everyone was watching because the world was here in Halifax through the media for that 1 week. Yeah. And then they left when the families were coming and all that. But people wanted to help here. The woman was on TV, was watching TV with her mom in the nursing home, and as they were watching, the woman in the next bed said with a weak voice, who was in this nursing home, "I'd like to help." Wow. And the nurse apparently said, I was so amazed to hear this, "Oh, what do you think you can do to help us?" And she said that with a compassionate voice. She said, "I can pray." Yeah. And the woman said, that's exactly what they need. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. So not diminishing anything that
Yeah.
someone can do is one of the things to learn, and the capacity for communities to respond. That you, I guess if I give anything, if you're an emergency manager watching this, or emergency social service person, or whatever that is new to it, don't get overwhelmed by your thought of what am I going to be able to do. You'll just fill in the blanks, and the ones who are most trained will often jump in to help mobilize. But it will get done, and it will get done the best way. And one thing that I will say is they always make mistakes in emergencies. You're going to just make new mistakes.
Yeah.
So don't be prepared for them. Just be prepared to make new mistakes, but to try to minimize them as much as possible. And that's what we try to do.
That's a great way to wrap up. Well, John, as always, thanks again for taking the time to share your experience, because I think that experience muscle is important, especially when you deal with situations like this. Everyone's new, but you can draw on some of the things that you learned in the past and the things that worked. So thank you so much for sharing, and take care.
Thanks, Leanne. You're welcome. Thank you very much.